I mentioned in the very beginning, in the intro, kind of our three pillars of privacy-centric marketing. And the first one being respect the rights and respect the privacy of our consumers. And there's a reason that that principle is the first of those three pillars. That principle of respect is really, really critical. And the way in which a lot of those requirements have been codified is in the regulations and the laws pertaining to consumers and the rights that they have with respect to their privacy. So to discuss a little bit more about that intersection of data strategy and the compliance piece, I am thrilled to introduce our next panel. First, Jo Davaris. She is the Chief Privacy Officer at Booking Holdings, as well as Brigette Geyer, who is the Data Protection Officer and Director of Data Governance and Privacy Management for the Wendy's company. So, Jo and Brigette.
Hello.
Hello, hello.
Hi.
Thank you both for joining us. I guess if we want to start and just kind of explain a little bit background, kind of role, and where you sit with respect to data privacy and data strategy.
Sure. So for those of you unfamiliar with Booking Holdings, we are the parent company of Booking.com, Priceline, Kayak, OpenTable, and Agoda. So those are our more familiar brands. So very much in the travel and related industries space. I am the Chief Privacy Officer there at the parent company. And so each brand has a Chief Privacy Officer or somebody responsible for privacy as 100% of their job. And my role at the parent company is to try to drive a consistent approach. We'll talk later on about consumer experience, maybe a consistent consumer experience, but that's down the line. And I came to privacy with a legal background. My first few roles were in the financial services space. We're highly regulated, so learned a lot about what it's like to be in that space and enjoyed the challenges now of everybody is in a highly regulated space, no matter who you work for when it comes to privacy and consumer protection. So excited to be here.
Great. Yeah, and I am with the Wendy's company. As it says, I'm our data protection officer. We do have an international footprint that we're growing by the day. And then I lead our data governance program as well as our privacy management. And when I say privacy management, that is really sort of our organization that's driving our data privacy strategy. But I say that with sort of keeping in mind that we can't do that in a vacuum. We are working with our marketing partners, our technology partners, our legal partners to actually make that work.
Nice. And you mentioned the partners, the internal teams and marketers, advertisers. I know a lot of our audience, most, is marketers and advertisers. So what is it that is one thing that you would love it if your marketing and advertising teams kind of understood from a compliance perspective?
Well, I think we're all focused on the same thing, coming at it from different lenses, to your point. Privacy can't exist without consumers. We are concerned about protecting consumers when we wear that hat and that role, and that's what every regulation is focused on as well. So I think the key is that partnership and understanding that we are all driving the strategic direction of our company through that data and consumer-focused lens.
Yeah, and I would maybe just add that, I think that we're doing it for the consumers and for data subjects a little bit more broadly, but also for the company. And I think there's a balance there. And so, for me, just knowing that we don't have conflicting interests. We want to achieve the same thing. Again, maybe coming from a different lens, a different perspective. I definitely see privacy as a way that we can appeal to our consumers. And what are your preferences? What do you want? Do you want a really customized experience? Great. Then we have a way to do that. If you don't, then I want to make sure you have options there. And so for me, really sort of thinking about it as just another perspective to bring into the conversation that's really important.
Okay. So working together in order to be able to get what's best for consumers. I know, I remember about probably 2 years ago or so, I was working with a client, and someone had brought up some ideas that were going around for different activities that could be done with data. And I started, kind of raising my hand, and they said, "Uh-oh, here comes the police." So it's this, I think this change in how that relationship has really kind of evolved, and working together towards, those same end goals at this stage.
Yeah, I think privacy, especially when it sits in legal and compliance, which is where I sit right now, and I know we're going to get to that, but is often thought of as the police, because we're supposed to be gatekeeping or helping to make sure that we're protecting consumer interests. But it's also because it's that lens of regulation and regulatory scrutiny. And I think we've moved past that because we can't keep pace with regulatory scrutiny. And so it's really, again, I think if we're all focused on the consumer and that consumer experience, that's going to have the consumer protection in mind, and let's all be on that same kind of partner path instead of policeman and citizen kind of path. I don't know.
It's not a battle. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes there's the perception of being the policing unit or the no man because we're not brought in early enough, and so there's that like, hold on, wait a second, wait, yeah, just
so true.
and so I'd say that's the other thing is if you do start to see your, depending on where you sit, your compliance team, your privacy team, as partners, you bring them into the discussion, you sort of make them a part of the overall strategy, then you also start to reduce that friction, and you get away from the no, it's yes, let's make sure we also do this and this and this. And so we might add some more things, but I think you really transition away from we're the police or we're going to say no, because I know that's never a good day for me if I do have to say no, something's broken down along the way, and you want to avoid that.
Yeah. So I think that's a good learning for all, is to move that discussion with the compliance folks and with legal further up in the process. It's not, hey, can you quickly review this right before we go to market? It is engage early in the process in order to be able to embed those principles into the strategy. I guess outside of that, for best practices for engaging with the compliance folks, any other kind of recommendations or things that you would really like to see, I guess, from teams?
I mean, I think it's just like Brigette was describing, even in the engagement model, it should not be anybody dictating what that engagement model is. It's come to the table together and develop an operating model together that meets everybody's interests.
Yep.
The privacy team only knows as much as you're sharing with them on what your goals are, what that roadmap looks like. And so building that together, building that operating model together can actually deploy the resources the right way as well, prioritize for everybody the right way as well.
Interesting.
When I think the way that and if we're talking about privacy, again, the regulation, the way that we see that moving is that it is sort of going into more of that advertising, marketing, digital space. So we're forced to come together there, and it's also sort of overlapping then with technology. So you can't continue to operate with those as silos, or to your point, sort of getting hey, I'm going to go live with something next week. Can you just review this real quick? Do you want to add any language? That we really have to we're forced to move away from that model. And so the sooner that you start to work together, and again, see it as just another point of view and come to appreciate that, and maybe that eases the burden on you, and you're not so worried about those different aspects because they're out there, but you don't know what it exactly is that you have to do. Those partners can help bridge that gap.
Yeah. And you mentioned for that, operating models, you mentioned kind of regulation outpacing things. And so, especially in the US with patchwork privacy, and everything is so disparate, so many different requirements, and it's crazy. How do you think that US-based organizations could kind of develop an operating model or a framework in order to be able to meet the requirements in a reasonable way.
You want to take this first?
Yeah, thanks. So, I try to find what are the core principles that we have from a privacy strategy.
Okay.
And if we keep our core principles in mind, and then we sort of take those and we then work on what's that broader digital strategy and how do we incorporate those in, then I think it takes some of the guesswork or sort of the challenges that we see that, well, this state has this state has this, and if you can sort of get to a place where you're comfortable of sort of broadening and saying, we will, where we have really specific things that we have to do, but generally we're going principle based and we're trying to sort of hit maybe a little higher level watermark than we need to. Again, it's not just to meet a legal obligation, but it's who we are as a business, and it's something that we're bringing to our customers, that it eases that stress and sort of that burden of having all these different, the patchwork, because maybe you're hitting at a little bit higher level.
Okay.
Just to add, you can actually bring a lot of order to what feels chaotic when you look at it from the principal's perspective. Almost every single regulation has a lot of commonality around it. Where it gets different is really in the very detailed nuances for the most part right now. There are some proposed regulations that will add additional differences and additional risk exposure, but for the most part, if you can be the ones that, from a privacy expertise perspective, privacy experts can help at least interpret the regulations in that way and create the order. And then what operationalization looks like and what the reality of operationalization looks like, are you going to go state by state or are you going to do most restrictive, is really, again, where we rely on our tech teams, our marketing teams, on what would be the impact in each of these scenarios.
Interesting. We've mentioned a couple of times kind of working together with teams and privacy principles in order to be able to deliver the best experience for the consumer. Oftentimes with things like cookie banners, it's not a great consumer experience that is kind of being rolled out there. And I think a lot of the reason for that is organizations simply just trying to check those boxes and do kind of that bare minimum. I guess, why do you think that many organizations are taking that type of an approach? And how do you think that potentially we can do better in order to be able to optimize the experience while also delivering on those privacy rights?
I think there's a bit of just sort of status quo. In the US, we didn't necessarily have to deal with privacy regulations that much, and so it's changing. And so I think there's this new dynamic of our strategy, right? If we want to have a digital strategy, a data strategy, whatever that might be, but there's this newer component. And the more that we can integrate that in, and again, sort of focus on, this is another way to appeal to our consumer, to our customer. This is another way to provide them with what they want. Then I think that you can get past but what do we have to do to meet our legal requirements? And then I think the more that you bring in partners or, it's not just the legal team, but for me, I'm a data team. I'm not a legal person, coming from an IT background. And so being able to maybe bring those differences of thoughts to expand beyond like, hey, yep, this is what we legally need to do, but to make this operationally effective so that we can do it every day.
Okay.
Or to make sure that we're not, every time a reg changes sort of in the middle of oh my gosh, we have to do an audit now, but it has an operational flow and it's something that you're continuing to do. I think those are some ways that you can start to think about and get away from just sort of that check the box of like, this is the bare minimum that we can do. But if you think about it of like, it makes us more operationally effective. It makes us sort of be able to do this on an ongoing basis, and think about it from how can we meet consumer needs and sort of shift that strategy, because we're forced to now.
Yeah.
You'll start to get to a different place.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't think we're doing enough to pause and think about the consumer. I think it's exactly as Bridget was describing, this box ticking exercise to implement or meet different competing regulations, also not all in the privacy space, some in the consumer protection space, right? Prior to there being state-by-state regulations or the European regulations. And so I think you almost need to tag people with that responsibility if they don't exist in your organization. Not every organization has a consumer experience or customer experience person, and I think your legal teams, if that's who you're relying on just to tell you what it needs to say, aren't necessarily going through the experience. I think you should just have these pauses and these moments in time where it looks like you're actually going through it from the customer experience perspective. We recently had to do that with our CEO because of just some oddities going on with our interpretation of cookies, especially from a European perspective. And when you actually went through and saw what it looked like from a new customer perspective, which also people forget to go through that experience if you've been an existing customer, to see what it was like from a new customer perspective. It's amazing that people continue with some of these products at all, because you think you're afraid. You know, like the pop-ups and the walls and I guess you don't want my business. Right? Is literally what it starts to feel like. Just like Stephen was using the example of the brick and mortar experience. Like if we think about these more and more from that brick and mortar physical experience perspective, you start to understand what the digital experience is like and how many customers we lose or don't delight. The threshold should be delighting our customers, not just making sure we're slapping them with lots and lots of notices.
And that actually reminds me of Google recently did some research for the privacy experience, and a positive privacy experience from consumers I think could raise brand trust and kind of brand equity by as much as 30 or 40%. So thinking about that privacy experience and the experience of the consumer as they're interacting with banners or notices or whatever that may be can have a direct translation on the bottom line. We talked a little bit, or you mentioned a few times, kind of some of the kind of operationalization, operational strategy, things like that. What do you think are some of the challenges that organizations face when trying to operationalize, just putting privacy principles in place, and how do you think that they can address potentially some of those challenges?
We were talking a little bit about this before because we report into different individuals. I've reported into very different individuals throughout my career, and whether or not that makes a difference or not. It definitely makes a difference in terms of reporting into somebody different has a different interpretation of your role and what you are delivering to your organization, but it shouldn't make a difference in terms of what you deliver to the customers, right? And so again, it's really about coming up with an understanding of how privacy is something that will drive your growth, enable your growth. And when I say privacy, I mean respecting consumers' rights, right? Will drive and enable growth, and that is everybody's responsibility, and then helping everybody in the organization understand how it is part of all of their jobs, and we're just kind of translators. I think is key, but it's what's missing a lot of times. We continue, for whatever reason, to work in silos. Even if on paper we have communicated all the right things, we're not coming together to operate and work from an organizational perspective together.
I mean, I think you said it perfectly, Joe. And how do we get away from the tactical and start looking forward, designing with that in mind, and thinking about that as it's not going away. I mean, I think everybody would love for this sort of problem to go away. It's not going away. It's going to get bigger, and so just kind of stop thinking about it as, well, this is like a compliance thing and I can just do this one thing and then I'll be done and I've satisfied it, but really integrating it into that design and the build and making it part of the story and what you want to achieve. And when you have your head of marketing or digital going and talking to executives, that's part of the story and what they're telling. And so it's not just coming from this maybe like legal compliance, this is what we need to do, scare tactics, there's this $1.2 billion fine that just happened, we need to react to this, but really getting buy-in ahead of time and taking away the silos, making it part of your journey as an organization, what you're trying to achieve in sales, in digital, whatever that might be.
Interesting. So being proactive, essentially, as opposed to reactive in a lot of these cases. Stephen mentions with some of the evolution of technology and modeling, AI really being built in. I know that can bring a lot of kind of privacy challenges. Are there any kind of really big pitfalls that you think are critical? Top line, call this out as it relates to those types of technologies that you think people should be on the lookout for?
Well, it's changing fast. And I mean, the technology is changing, but so are the regulations, and we can't necessarily keep up with it. So I feel like we're on the ride with everyone else. I would say I try not to be fearful of it. I think it can do good, right? And we need to figure out, because it's going to be there, it's going to be utilized. So how do we get in and make sure we're not saying no, but like how do we sort of fit into that? And without having all the answers, I go back to like, and again, sorry guys, this is, but principles. What are our principles? So, how are we transparent? How do we give choice? And how do we do this ethically? And you can double click into that quite a few times to start to say like, oh yeah, how do we do that? But I think if you aren't hiding from it or assuming it's not going to come and be a part of the reality, and you start having that discussion early, and again, sort of, we don't know all the answers, it might change. We might have to adapt, but how do we think about those principles and really embed it in there with the idea of, how do we do the right thing for our consumers?
Yeah.
I mean, AI has been around for a while, right?
True.
And our companies, if they've been in the digital space, have been using some form of AI for a while. What's new is the generative form of it, right? The faster paced form of it. So again, I think it goes down to principles. I keep saying principles. But seriously, what is your company's ethos when it comes to ethics and data ethics, right? And whatever preceded generative AI should still be within your fibers. And if you didn't commit to something from an ethical culture when it comes to data perspective, then now is the time definitely to make it clear what your organization's thoughts are around, transparency, consent, if you're going to use AI, how it impacts the consumer. Again, that customer experience. Are there biases that are natural within it? Are you okay with those biases? Some organizations might be okay with it. I hope you don't work in an organization that's okay with it, but maybe you do. So I think it's, again, just bringing to the forefront, making sure that you have documented all of those considerations, that you're having the conversations with each other, and if you need to, challenge up that there isn't enough clarity in your organization about the risk appetite there, about the ethical culture there, because if you don't challenge up, you won't have enough direction on what it is that you want to build and how you want to build it, or how they expect you to build it.
And I just want to add, I think revisiting that, because it's not one time, or just because you looked at what are we putting into the model, what came out of the model, that can change over time. And so I think that that's another important concept. And when we talk about privacy, it's not a one-time thing. You can't just like do this thing and be done and then you're done. It's continuous. It's decisions that you're making on a daily basis that might be impacting that. And I think that's true for AI. And when we talk about data ethics, that you can't just sort of like sit in one place on that. That has to be something you continue to look at and talk about and evolve.
Nice. So if we want to kind of condense some of the primary principles that we have covered here today. I guess defining those principles for your organization, defining what your standards are, involving privacy compliance into the process early at the strategic point, and always be considering those principles whenever making any kind of decisions around data or new strategic activities or directions that are being taken. I guess, yeah, a decent summary?
Yeah, very good summary.
Any other kind of final thoughts that you all have that you think are really critical to
So I'll admit I knew this question was coming, like all of the questions. And I was trying to come up with, I do mnemonics or kind of ways to remember things for my team, for myself, for goals-wise. It also works organizationally. If you're all like, if you have slogans, might be because I've been married to a marketer for like many years. So I thought of it as communicate, collaborate, educate, and documentate, which isn't really a word, but we'll go with it, for this group, okay? So the communicate and collaborate is everything that we've been talking about with each other, across the organization, coming early, coming together often, grabbing coffee, grabbing lunch. This is how we know what's going on. It doesn't have to be just in the formal meetings. Educate goes both ways. Those wearing the privacy, legal, and compliance hats need to be educated with what CIOs, CMOs, CTOs, and their teams are thinking about, but also what technologies they're using. You have to get more technically literate, but also those organizations need to get comfortable enough with understanding the regulations. If they need a cheat sheet, demand a cheat sheet, so that you can start thinking through how it impacts your organization and challenge the legal and compliance team. You need that checks and balance. And then documentate. Your legal people are going to be really good at documenting everything. It's going to be really important for marketing teams, technology teams to also document. One reason is because regulators look for at least a plan, a roadmap, that you had good intentions even when something went wrong, because things go wrong, right? And so those are my 3 quickie things.
Love it. I think it's great. Yep. Yep.
Thank you.
Even documentate. Yeah, I think for me it is, having a little bit of vulnerability in being willing to kind of go to your partners and say, this is changing, and not just from sort of like the technology piece, but our privacy landscape and sort of what's expected of us is shifting. And being open, I think it's that education where it needs to go both ways, where I might know what we need to do, but that comes with a lot of sort of like technical challenges. So how do we do that, and how do we do that long term, and just not sort of sitting here and like, oh, I know everything to do, but going out and asking for help and thinking about that as sort of a relationship that you have internally, so that you can come up with what is the best way to do that, and know that your privacy team, your group that's supporting you from a privacy perspective does not know all the answers, and so they need help as well. And I think that's where you have that opportunity and that partnership, and to really drive that strategy and know that helping develop the strategy from the privacy perspective is there as well.
Nice. Well, wonderful insights. Thank you both very, very much for joining us and sharing them here today. And yeah, everyone remember, put in those privacy principles, respect those privacy rights of consumers.
And take your privacy officer to coffee.
Yes. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.